Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing.
Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death. I am your host, Victoria Lafont.
I'm your other host, Hannah Wright, MS, NTP.
Oh yeah, our qualifications. I think they're listed now. And
They
so
are
people
listed.
at least can see
People know.
because I'm going to forget constantly. So welcome back. Today we are talking about a 3-letter word that for people is like a 4-letter word, which is soy.
What would be the 4-letter word?
Oh, it's like a way to say that people see it as a bad word. Like a 4-letter word? I think that's like a saying.
Oh my gosh. I'm not good with stuff like that, my brain. I'm simple.
Okay, also not for nothing. We started before 9 a.m. on a Sunday. So we like kicked our families out of the house and we're recording a podcast on soy. So if we are a little slow on the uptake today, that's why. Okay, so I have a little bit of an update from the Medical Medium podcasts that we put out last month. I got a lot of people contacting me, texting, messaging me on social media saying like, oh my God, I had no idea that this person didn't have any type of training. I mean, there's all kinds of training that you can get, but no qualification to be saying what he's saying. And then people reaching out to me also that we've known professionally for a long time saying like, hey, this person has concerned me also. I'm really glad to see that, somebody's saying something. So a lot of positive feedback for that episode. And so far, no letters from Medical Medium's lawyer, which is what we've legitimately been worried about. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about soy, and we actually were going to talk about this last month, but when we started looking at the research literature, we were both like,
yeah, it's a lot.
It's complicated. Mm-hmm. This is a complicated food. Like, I've actually wondered as we've been reading if there are any other foods out there that are as kind of like as complicated, like show up in the human body in so many different ways as soy. It's a very interesting food. So we have continued to read, and we actually don't have a conclusion to give you. We're going to have a conversation today about soy based on what we've learned, and we're really open to hearing what your interactions with soy have been. And we even contacted one of the country's top soy experts to see if maybe he would come on a future episode to give his expertise. So, Mark, please check your LinkedIn. What is his last name? Mark Messina, I think is his name. Sir, if you're listening to this, we would love to have you on the podcast. Okay, so if you want to get a hold of us, you can find us on Instagram at Influence to Death. Our Substack is at InfluencedPod. And then you can email us at influencetodeath@gmail.com. We've actually gotten some great show recommendations lately from listeners, so please contact us. We love that. Okay, anything else before we dive into soy?
No, I think you covered it. This is a lot of information. We're just going to try to keep it as, I guess, relaxed as possible and just kind of present you with that it's complex, basically, with what we found. And yeah. It's always really interesting. I've learned a lot in just from this research, things that I did not know before. So I'm excited to share that with everyone.
Okay, so personal check. Do you eat soy?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, me too. And
I didn't for a long time, though, because I was terrified of soy.
You were influenced to terror.
I was. I mean, maybe terror is a large word, but I was like, I don't eat soy. Like, soy is bad for you. Soy is going to give you cancer. All these things. I mean, really, we can talk more about that in the bias.
So yeah, and actually, I just thought this. We didn't even research this, which is reminiscent of a conversation that I had earlier this week. I just Googled to see, is soy one of the top common allergens? But I'm thinking back to immunology. Didn't even put that in the document. So I think that's something to be aware of, is that there are, is it like 10 or 12 like very common?
8.
8, okay.
So it's soy, wheat, nuts, dairy, what's the other
Oysters,
one?
right? Like shellfish.
Shellfish,
Yep.
I think. And then I
Are
should know this.
peanuts separate from tree nuts?
Yeah.
Okay, hang on. We can just Google this. I'm going to be our this I feel like all of a sudden it's like a Sunday morning pop quiz. And when we say allergen, we mean like people eat these foods and they're the top foods where people have an anaphylactic, like a true what is called scientifically an IgE hypersensitivity. Okay, so foodallergy.org. I'm just going to read off of there. This looks like pretty legit. Milk, egg. Yeah,
Egg.
milk, egg, peanut, soy, wheat, tree nut, shellfish, fish, and sesame are the
Yes.
top allergens. And that sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conversation I actually had this past week, I was at a summit and one of our friends had a anaphylactic reaction to almonds. She's truly like throat close up allergic to almonds. And she was talking about kind of the interesting occurrence that all of these foods that were being served at the event were labeled as either gluten or dairy free. And she was like, I'm not, you know, she's a naturopathic doctor. Like she is very, very educated. She's like, I'm not saying that it's not important to avoid, gluten or dairy if you're sensitive, but you're not going to die immediately. Usually with, I guess, milk
Unless you have a
is
wheat
on that
allergy
list.
or
Yeah, that's true. But I think they're labeling it because it's like people have sensitivities or like I'm celiac. I like really appreciate that the
Right.
glutinous foods are, but she's like, I will die on the floor in the conference room. And thankfully her reactions weren't that extreme, but she had just been like ingesting, she thinks, a little bit of almond flour like many times. And I was like, oh yeah, like for me, and as evidenced by this document, I was like, oh yeah, I completely forgot that soy is a common allergen. I've just been looking at how it interacts with people in other ways, but like that's a really important big way that interesting. I just think it's kind of interesting. I just completely forgot until right now. You didn't forget, did you? For thinking
Didn't
about
forget.
it. Okay.
But I was like, dude, I can't add any more to this document. This is like so heavy. And I'm sure we'll touch on it. It'll just come up because it is, but so what I'm thinking about with the soy topic is that it's really controversial and some people are really passionate about the dangers of soy.
Yeah.
Those dangers usually don't have anything to do with, as far as from those talking points, about soy allergy. It's more about the hormonal effects of soy and things like that. And so you can't really argue with an allergy. Like an allergy is an allergy and it's black and white. It is what it is. And lots of foods, like you said, those are the top ones, but there's more.
Right.
You can have an allergy to
Anything.
anything, and it develops for many different reasons. And so it doesn't necessarily have to do with, obviously, like the nutritional or beneficial parts of that food. It's just like you're allergic to it for these reasons. So that's why I didn't throw it in there, because I was like, this is a whole other topic that maybe could go with food allergies, like, because I really would love to have an episode about food hypersensitivity and allergy and intolerance and like the deal with all that, because like you just said, like those diets, like being gluten-free or dairy-free or whatever, are really popular. And how does that differ from someone who's like has a medical response, like it's a serious response, whether it be anaphylaxis, an IgE mediated response, or something like celiac disease or gluten
Totally
hypersensitivity.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
what's going on there. So
God, yeah, that is going to be a very interesting episode. And I'm like, can we please call in an immunologist for that?
yes, Dr. Zwicky, can you come on the podcast?
Paging. Okay, yeah, Mark Messina, we've got to call it for you. Dr. Heather Zwicky, you're next. We're coming for you. Okay, so soy. I love my little joke that I made. I joke about that with SEO because it's like, a 3-letter word that people are like, that's the 4-letter word. So, but soy, what you're saying, both of us had the experience of being influenced by an organization that said, hey, soy is something that you absolutely need to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
And Hannah, what was your introduction to the Weston A. Price Foundation?
Dang, that's a good question. I don't know, but it was heavily influential for me. I have Nourishing Traditions. I have, that was like a book I relied heavily on. And this was like, probably end of high school and like college, like before I was actually studying nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love food history and like cultural like aspects of food and food anthropology, nutritional anthropology. And so I loved reading like the asides on the pages about like different countries and like how the food's traditionally used. Like, so I was really drawn to that because of my love for that. And I loved reading like little snippets about like all these things that were just really like fascinating to me. But then now I'm like wondering how accurate it all is based on other things I've learned and how like the Weston A. Price Foundation makes certain claims about things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, is that real, or what's going on here? So now I still am fascinated by everything that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is important, and they do have a lot of good information. But eventually, I think it wasn't until actually graduate school that I started to be like, wait a minute. And especially with soy, because yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off. That was truly how I
started
felt.
Realizing I was just going off on this long tangent and maybe we're not ready for yet. So
I loved it. I was like completely captivated because I was like, yes. So my journey is like you said, high school, early college, and I was like, oh, that was early, but that's kind of, I found nourishing traditions in the bookcase of the community I lived in Hawaii. And I like distinctly remember that the pages were so moldy because we were living down on the east coast of Big Island, and it was like everything molded. I actually still have mold in me. I can't remember the technical name of it, but howley rot from living down there. It's like on my back right now because it blooms in the summer, and I don't know what I have to do to get rid of it. Anyway,
that's wild.
Oh yeah, I've like it used to be so bad. There's like a technical name for it, and you're supposed to they say to use Selsun Blue to get rid of it because it's an antifungal. I've used it in the past, but it's systemic at this point. I have howley rot that lives in me. Howley is the Hawaiian kind of like slang term for white people, and we are more susceptible to this type of fungus, and so it's white people rot is what it translates into. Anyway, this is a little different than soy, but it was like I have tattoos all over my arms, and it like completely took over. I mean, it's like subtle, but you're like, something is like wrong with that person's skin. Everything in Puna molds like that, and the books do too. And so I remember like finding Nourishing Traditions on the bookshelf at Pangaea and opening it, and it's smelling. It was like moldy, but I was obsessed with that book. There was something about it. If people haven't seen that book, it's Nourishing Traditions. It's a cookbook / kind of like Hannah was saying, like sort of like an account of different cultures and how to prepare foods and like that. And it's published by the Weston A. Price Foundation. And I have a copy back here somewhere that I can maybe.
Oh yeah, I have my copy. I could grab it and
put a photo in the show notes. It's this beautiful, very comforting, farming, family-centered. It's a really sweet book. But so the idea that we want to convey to you, though, is that foundation is very, very, very against the consumption of soy foods. And while I'm with you, I think they're net positive. I think that the influence that they have put out into the world, I mean, I think it's net positive. It's I call it like the gateway drug for a lot of people to get into this world of like thinking about nutrition and living in a way closer to the earth. But they say some things that are absolutely batshit crazy. Like soy is one of those. There was a huge controversy a few years ago around cod liver oil with them that just...
Got to talk about that at some point in the show.
Yeah, that'll be a totally different episode. But and that is how I also was introduced to soy. And I entered into that world as a vegan. So when I lived in Eugene before moving to Hawaii, we would eat every meal. I mean, it's like the main source of protein for most vegans. I also, though, will say I was captivated by what the Weston A. Price Foundation had to say because I had such bad digestive problems when I was a vegan. I was celiac, right? But then I didn't know.
Yeah.
And And so I was like, oh, maybe it's the soy and these different foods I've been ingesting as a vegan that have been causing these digestive problems. Anyway, so for years, I didn't eat soy. I like consciously avoided eating soy foods, even like wonderfully prepared, organic, even soy sauces. I wouldn't eat. I would eat like Bragg's aminos. Remember those?
Oh yeah, I still use them.
Yeah, and they're derived from soy, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it just I had this
Kind of
like idea in my
confusing.
mind if it said soy, and
Yeah.
sort of like you when I like maybe a little before we started to grad school, I would crave tofu because we used to make this dish in Eugene that was just like this charred broccoli and tempeh with nutritional yeast cheese sauce. I don't know if anybody out there has made
So good.
it is so good. And so I
Yeah.
would crave tempeh and tofu. And finally I was like, this is nuts. I'm like craving it. I'm gonna eat it. And then I started to read more about the actual story on soy.
Which is
So
what
yeah,
we're going to talk about today. Just what's out there on soy when you actually start looking for evidence on it.
right. And it is not straightforward. So
Yeah.
kind of the history, we're just gonna give a brief history on soy. It actually kind of came into the lens of the scientific community because of a little bit of controversy. And this is interesting. So let's back up a little bit. Soy contains mainly these two, but in totality, three phytoestrogens. So these phytonutrients, and they are, and as I'm looking at this, I'm like, I've been reading these words for the past like month and I have no idea how to pronounce them. So get ready. Genistein, daidzein, Daidzein. Mark Messina is going to have a stroke. He's never coming on the show now. Daidzein and glycitein. So there's these three compounds, these isoflavones that are in soy, and they also happen to be contained in clover. And so what scientists saw is that these sheep were grazing primarily on this certain type of clover that was rich in these isoflavones. Again, they're phytoestrogens. And these sheep were having fertility issues. They weren't conceiving and giving birth the way that they should have been. And so this was in the 1940s. Scientists were like, something is going on here. Again, this is the part that is interesting. It wasn't soy, it was clover. But the clover contained the same compounds, the same phytonutrients as soy. Also, a couple more things I'll just point out that will keep coming up during the episode. Sheep aren't people.
Mhm.
They are sheep. Rats are not people either. And petri dishes are not people, although we kind of get those things conflated a lot when we
Yep.
talk about evidence. And Hannah, I think I speak for both of us, but you tell me where you stand. Any research that needs to happen, cell research, right, that happens in a petri dish, right? Like no living animals involved, rat studies, there's all kinds of studies with animals. I'm cool. We need that research. We need that to understand mechanism, right? Like how something works in the body theoretically, but you can't directly, there's not a direct relationship between cell studies and animal studies and what happens in a human being. So the third thing I'll point out is that these sheep obviously were sheep. The food was not soy. And they were primarily eating this as their only food source. So they started to see these fertility problems, though, and it kind of alerted people like, could foods that are high in these particular isoflavones, and you're probably going to hear us butcher those words more throughout the episode, could there be an issue in people who are eating those foods and fertility, even if they're not eating clover like the sheep were? Even further back, soy, I mean, it goes back thousands of years. So kind of the first like documented occurrence of people consuming soy was in China in 7000 BCE. So
A long time ago, y'all.
1000 something
Yeah.
years ago. That's about as far back as you can go when humans started to, become agriculturalists versus hunter-gatherers. And currently it's the most economically important bean in the world. It's the king of money beans, essentially. So they were introduced into the United States in 1804. So that's been, hundreds of years now. And they were really important in the South and the Midwest as a crop. And that's what my family farms. Is they mainly farm corn and soybeans and then winter wheat. So, I mean, it's a beautiful plant. actually. When you see it growing, it's like this big, bushy, so beautiful. It looks fertile and it looks like feminine, and it's a beautiful plant to see. So that's the history that I gathered about soy. Is there anything, Hannah, that you want to add, or?
That you have it in here actually, but I mean, like you said, it's a huge money crop. And by now, the majority of soybean crops are genetically modified to be resistant to glyphosate, which is a very powerful herbicide. So that just means that you can spray glyphosate on it and it won't harm the plant because it's resistant to it. And that is something that I think is important to keep in mind with soy. And we can talk more about that later. But
Yeah.
yeah,
You did some good research on that.
the history is really interesting. And I think it's important to note, like you said, that clover has isoflavones. Other foods have isoflavones, like regular foods we eat every day. It's just not as much as soy does. Soy is like a particularly very, very rich source of them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. So those beans are called Roundup Ready, or at least they used to be. And when I was young, farmers have seed delivered to them. They order it, and it's, people don't think of it because it's just like the food comes to the grocery store, right? But it's like it does come from somewhere. It comes from a farm in Southern Illinois, some of it where my family farms. And so these huge bags of beans would be sitting in my dad's shop. And I remember he would say to me, don't get near those. Like don't touch them, So some are pre-treated with, I don't even know if it is Roundup, and then definitely genetically modified so that when you plant them, the chances of them coming up are higher because they already have this pre-treatment of herbicide or fungicide or like that on there. Yeah, it's not a pristine, woman in a white dress with an apron hanging laundry. That's not the vibe. Different vibe. People doing an honest, loving work every day. I always feel like, oh, that's my family out there doing that. But it is definitely genetically modified, and there's a lot of chemical that's used to grow most soy, I would guess, probably in the world, not just in the United States. So, okay, so should we dive into?
Yeah, let's go into the evidence of what we found. There's more. There's so much more, y'all.
Oh my God, we're going to just touch on this humbly. Yeah. We're going to very humbly discuss this. Do we usually say our bias before we get into the evidence, or is that?
No. Oh
I forget. Because it's Sunday morning at 0:00. I feel like we have in the past. We say our bias first.
I will know if I look in an old doc.
And just a reminder to listeners, almost every episode, there's some interviews where people come on with us where the setup gets a little wonky, but we, in every episode, go through the history of the topic. I think our bias, like how we feel about a topic, so that look, no human is a clean slate. We're not either. We want you to know kind of where we stand. The evidence that we found, we try to find evidence that supports our bias, does not support our bias, all the evidence we bring, and then the takeaway.
Bias after. Why was that so hard for me?
I don't know. Yeah. After the evidence or before?
After the history. Like
after,
right now.
Okay, so, yeah. Also, does it matter? We're the ones in charge.
I know.
My OCD brain locked onto that so hard. I was like, I can't let it go. Yeah. What is how do you feel about soy? Like, what is your bias?
Okay. Initially, like I said, I was very, I guess, biased against soy. Like, I was very cautious of it. I would tell other people to watch out for it. Mostly like my friends and stuff, and all of that was influenced by the Weston A. Price Foundation. I had never read a lick of research on soy, had no idea the benefits of soy, had no idea of how soy acts in your body or anything, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say that. Like, I was influenced by it, and I was like, this makes sense, cool, no soy for me. And that was for many, many years. I wasn't as stringent as avoiding soy sauce. I was just like, I'm not going to drink soy milk. I'm not going to buy tofu and all that. And then fast forward to being in graduate school was the first time I actually read research on soy as required
Yeah.
for, I can't remember what class it was.
It was Dr. Redwood's class. I totally
Yes,
remember.
yes. And I I think, there was like a summary or something about the benefits of soy, and I was like, this is crazy. And then I went to the research papers and I was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is really interesting. Like these benefits and these links that I was told that it had with like increasing cancer risk in women and all these things. This is showing it's actually the opposite. And it just kind of expanded my mind. And it was one of the things actually that kind of helped me begin to question like everything that I had these preconceived ideas about that were really not based on anything except for influence of Weston A. Price or anyone else, people like influencing me. Yeah. So now after that, I didn't like go gung ho like I'm gonna put soy in everything, but I was much more like, oh, okay, I can eat tofu and I can eat tempeh, and I can put soy milk in my smoothie. I personally only use organic soy that has not been treated with that's not that's not GMO and that has not been treated with Roundup or any other herbicides or pesticides. So that's like
Every time I think that, I'm like, I hope that that's true.
It might not be. It could still have residue on there. That's very possible. So that's kind of where I stand. I'm not a heavy consumer. And now, after reading the stuff that we're going to talk about today about kind of individual differences and how you respond to soy and how the gut microbiome plays a part in that and how that could be potentially due to your ancestry or your genes. Now I'm like, oh, this is really interesting because this kind of is again changing how I'm viewing this and how it benefits me.
Yeah. And
maybe it's not as beneficial as I thought it was from reading the research about the benefits of it, just because I'm a unique person and I know my ancestry pretty well. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not the person for soy. Like I shouldn't be eating it that much. So.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'm very similar to you, Hannah. And I remember those studies from Dr. Redwood's class because I always thought like soy bad. And then we got in there and I'm pretty sure there were papers that are either the same, I can't even remember the exact authors and like that of the papers that he presented, but we found very similar research where it actually was shown that there was a connection between higher intake of soy and soy foods and a lower incidence of breast cancer in women, and then a lower like a recurrence of breast cancer in women who had had breast cancer when they would eat soy. So epidemiological studies that showed links. And just to like point out to listeners, the studies are really helpful. They're not controlled trials, right? They're looking at patterns in humans, and there absolutely is a lot of room for error to happen in epidemiological studies. It's very complex to set up a study like that, and you're looking at usually a lot of people, but that's also the benefit is you're looking at a lot of people and patterns, so you can kind of start to get an idea of like maybe what's happening. And when they are controlled well, and hopefully there's some boundaries put around epi studies, you can see some really cool things. You can start to see some really cool things. But just to point out, it is different than a clinical, or a controlled trial where you're directly influencing somebody with an intervention, like feeding them soy and seeing what happens. Those studies that we looked at were just showing the kind of the link. But it was a positive link, and that was super surprising to me too. Dude, I love soy. I am like, I mean, I say that, but I actually sometimes I have, still rosacea. I'm like wondering, I use soy a lot with caffeine because I use it to make matcha lattes, or I put it in my, oh my God, if I didn't have Earl Grey tea, I don't know, I think I would just sink into a hole in the earth. So I'm pairing it with that. And I'm like, I'm probably having a little bit of a reaction to the caffeine. But sometimes I'll like blame soy. Like I can feel that like brain worm come back where I'm like, is it bad? And I just maybe like, I've been reading these studies for all these years, but like there's still something going on, which is evidence to how deep sometimes influence can be on us this is separate from the studies, that we're going to show where it's like, it isn't good for everybody. We're going to talk about that. I think it is, though, very good for me, but that influence is still so deep in my psyche that it is influencing me today. And that's just as like a meta point for the show. I think sometimes even when we get different or new information, when we get a neural pathway that is formed about a food and we start to interact with that food or that idea or that, whatever in a certain way, it's not as easy as just like letting it go and doing something else. There are all these emotions tied to it and like fear and hope around how our body works. It's very, deep sometimes. So I can feel that in myself, and I imagine that other people have that experience too. So yeah, I love soy. I love Westlife soy milk. Westlife, again, we're some shout outs in this episode. If you want to sponsor us, big ups. I buy that soy milk in, I don't even know what, it's like the biggest, it's like 2 quarts. And
it's like the carton, like the paper, that fortified paper carton, right? Yeah, it's good.
So wonderful. And the only ingredients are organic soybeans and water. That's it. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I started using it instead of, I think like, I don't know what I was putting in smoothies before, but I was like, it has more protein. It's high protein.
High protein,
and
yeah.
It's usually lower in fat, which fat is good. But I've been like on a, improving body composition for the last like 2 years. So I'm like, maybe this is something I can add in to, meet those macro, like, kind of shift those a little bit.
Did you ever think that you and I would be talking about eating a high protein, low fat soy milk?
No, which is hilarious. But it's true to your point. Like, you're so ingrained with that.
Dude, I was like a disciple of Sally Fallon. If they sold like holy candles with her picture on it, I'm sure I would have had a couple and would eat like a pat of butter with every vegetable, like.
Same, dude.
And I was like, I wonder why my stomach's so upset all the time. Okay, so that's where we come from with soy. We have a complicated past with it too. It's interesting. It's like this is so woo-woo. It's like woo-woo-woo-woo-woo. But like, what a karmically interesting plant, It's like it makes waves in all kinds of ways and even in our personal lives. Okay, so when you go on to PubMed, which is one of the biggest databases of, if not maybe the biggest database of research available, and you type in soy, you get over 23,000 results. We're talking about evidence now, and that's the bulk of, we've been raring to go and putting a lot of time into figuring out what is actually happening with soy scientifically. In the last 10 years, you can filter your results on PubMed. So if you just go to more recent studies, it reduces down to about 10,000 results. So needless to say, we did not read all 10,000 research papers, although we did read more than we thought, which is why we're doing the episode this month instead of last month. And then we covered the main kind of component that is studied in soy. There's a lot of components. There's fiber, there's fat. It is a high protein. It's the highest protein non-animal food, which is amazing for people. But the main constituents that are studied are these phytonutrients. They're phytoestrogens. So it's a non-steroidal type of estrogen. And I'm going to try to pronounce it again. Genistein, daidzein, glycitein. How about that?
I think that sounded perfect.
Just going to roll it off.
Yeah, it rolls right off the tongue.
There's a word for that when you read a word a lot, but you can't pronounce it.
I've actually wondered if there's a way to study that in people who are scientists or researchers, yes. And like if that happens more with them, because we're constantly reading these like wild words over and over and over, and like it's ingrained in you. You know how to spell it, you know how to, but you never say it out loud, I guess, unless you're like presenting or you're lecturing. Yeah. And I wonder if it's more common in that group of people.
Listen, there's an outtake of me somewhere lecturing for the Nutritional Therapy Association on toxicity. Like we had like a detox module, and they had a list of all of these compounds that we're exposed to. And it's like on a teleprompter, and I'm in this, it's this beautiful greenhouse background. They came up to Tahoe to film me, and I start in on this list, and it was like, cue the clown music, like dun 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 dun. And they eventually cut it out. Like I was like, you guys, I have no idea what I'm saying. So yeah, and it's happened to me in conversations where I wish that it hadn't, but you all are getting an inside look at, I'm surely this happens to scientists a lot, or people that read science. So here's the rub, is that these phytoestrogens, they are very, very similar in structure to the active form of estrogens, 17 beta-estradiol, commonly called E2, okay? And they do have biological activity in humans. So there are estrogen-like effects. And I think that that's a point that we need to really emphasize. It's not estrogen. That's where people get really strung up. Like I actually made a matcha latte for this awesome guy that comes and helps us work on our house in Kentucky. And he was like, wait a minute, there's soy milk in that? That's going to like make me have boobs. And I was like, no, nope. I mean, if you only ate that, pounds of it a day, maybe it would have an effect. Maybe it would have an effect like that. But like, dude, this is good for you. Okay. So people have this idea in their heads that it's estrogen and it's not. So that's important. And we see that in vitro studies, which means that it's in a petri dish, not in the human body, in vitro, and then in vivo in people, we can see those effects. So you found this next tidbit. Hannah, do you want to take over? I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, take a sip of water.
Probably tired of me at this point.
No, I love it. I mean, I feel like you've done the bulk of the research for this one, so I'm just listening and learning. So the next part in here that I found about isoflavones and cultural differences, as far as like how often someone's eating it, just like in their society, like what does that look like? So, because that's something that's talked a lot about. I feel like it's talked a lot about in the Weston A. Price Foundation, for instance, where they reference like differences in intakes. And I think actually what they reference is incorrect, because they say that in like different Asian countries like Japan or China, the average intake of soy is like 2 teaspoons a day. That's not true. I mean, maybe some people eat that much, but like as an average, like that's not right. It's actually much more than that. So I'm not sure where they get that from. But what Mark Messina noted in his Soy and Health Update article, which we have linked here, is that mean isoflavone intake among adults in Japan is 30 to 50 milligrams a day. And then in the United States, Canada, and Europe, it's less than 3 milligrams a day. So there's a big difference. And that is isoflavone, not like soy protein or soy.
Yeah, and it's something that I think both of us encountered in the studies that we were reading. Sometimes it was hard to tell, are they talking about soy as a whole food or isoflavones? I can't even pronounce that. Isoflavones as a constituent of soy.
Right.
And we did our best to suss that out, but in moments it was hard. It was hard to tell, because it really felt like, even when I was reading the research literature, people are conflating those two things. They're talking about soy solely as the parts that are in it. But we know for sure, I mean, I've researched this a lot. You look at the vitamin C in apples, or, the certain phytonutrients in berries, or like that. The whole food acts differently than the parts. And that is like why nutritional research is so complex, because not only is that true, but also when you eat that food, completely different things happen in the body than what happens in a test tube. So yeah, we're like complex within a complex. It's like nutritional studies are difficult for kind of all of those reasons, and we see that here too. We kind of looked to try and understand a little bit more about the milligram intake of isoflavones. So I'm just going to read this quote. And again, actually, this isn't Mark Messina. This is another author. It's a paper. It was a review paper that was a really balanced presentation of like, here's some benefits, here's our concerns about soy.
It's Amber Cooper, who's a medical doctor, and it was published in Fertility and Sterility. So basically looking like, is this going to make you sterile? Is this going to harm your fertility? Should we worry about this?
Yeah, and it was, I think, 2019. I remember the year, not her. Sorry, Amber, Dr. Amber. Yeah, and actually at the end of that article, she was like, with all of the information that I know today, I'm using soy milk this morning. And I was like, great, cool. I love hearing what a scientist is eating for breakfast. So that would be actually be a great episode. So this is, again, specifically to the three, and there are three isoflavones that are identified in soy. The main two you're going to hear about, because they're the primary ones that are found, is genistein and daidzein. The third one is not as prevalent in soy. But so she writes, for example, according to the United States Department of Agriculture data and an assumption of about a half cup serving, most vegetables contain less than 1 milligram of isoflavones. Miso contains more, 1 to 2 milligrams, which it's soy-based most of the time. And if it's not soy-based, it's actually legume-based, and they have the same isoflavones, just in lower quantities. Cooked edamame, so again, this is a half cup serving of cooked edamame, has 15 to 20 milligrams of isoflavones. Raw pistachios, 1 to 3 milligrams. Most soy milks, 1 to 10 milligrams. It's interesting, even within the soy milk, it's different. A huge range. And then some higher soy content cereals have 20 to 100 milligrams. Again, a huge range. So she says, like, meatless meats, like soy-based meats, depending on the soy that they're using, they have very little to very high. It just really depends on the soy and how they're produced. So there's a lot of factors that can influence the amount of isoflavones that you're getting when you eat soy. So,
and I wonder, just to add this in, looking at that info, which is pretty practical, you're like, how many isoflavones am I getting every day? Let me look at these foods I'm eating.
Mm-hmm.
And the average intake in Japan and then in the US, I wonder if it's not just from soy foods, but just like a wider variety of plant foods and legumes, because like you said, those also have them. And in the US, we don't eat the majority of us don't eat a lot of those foods, but in other countries they do. And so it could not just be the soy, but it's just like the diet as a whole contains more. That's all.
Yeah, that's very true. I actually, in the same class, I give Dr. Redwood a lot of credit for my plant food increase in my diet, because learning from him, he's like passionate about plant foods. It's so sweet to learn from him. But like I'll always get adzuki beans now, because they're like the most nutrient.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like learning about the benefits of these foods is, for the purposes of this podcast, I think it is very, very compelling, because we often hear about the detriment of food. And in his class, he covered concerns. Like, I felt like, he had a little bit of a bias toward plant foods, but like the bias was, legitimized by the fact that like there are so many more benefits than cons of most foods. But the way that most, marketing or like influencer material presents, it's like you can tell it is a take on food that is kind of meant to be scary. And so then being in an environment where somebody's like, hey, actually, the source of most information that we get shows that there are all these wonderful benefits. It felt so good to see that and hear that. And it's such a striking difference from what we're normally exposed to. For instance, this has nothing to do with our topic. I'm sorry, Hannah, I just have to say this. But when you go into the research literature and you start to read about wheat, it is wonderful.
Oh yeah, dude. That we're going to do a show about that, because that's going to be an episode. It's fascinating, especially coming from two people who do not eat wheat. But I will acknowledge that it is good for you as long as you don't have celiac disease, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat allergy, all of those things. So
yeah, we got to do a caveats. But okay, so but then there are concerns with soy, and we actually tried to focus on this because there are so many studies showing benefit. What we kind of do want to try and highlight is like, here's maybe some instances where you should be aware of what's happening. And Hannah, you found this and thought about it, and it's so funny with my background. I didn't even think about it, but
Yeah, do you want to talk about that now? The differences?
yeah. So you mean the differences in
Yeah, in like metabolism of isoflavones, or do you want to save that
go for it. Do you want to?
Okay.
And the glyphosate. I mean, we touched on that a little bit, but like
Yeah.
how it affects us.
So I guess two things to keep in mind with soy. Well, the glyphosate, that's just for anybody. But when you're looking at this research and you're like, well, this says it's really good for you, but then this study says it's not good. And it's kind of like, why would there be this huge difference between these two studies, and why is the research so conflicting? So something I found that I did not know anything about until I read it yesterday, is that we as people metabolize and break down isoflavones differently. And it has to do with our gut bacteria. And that is something that is unique to us. And it has nothing to do with how much soy you eat. So it has to do with you and your ancestry, your what's passed down to you through gut bacteria, and genetically, your differences. So this is a quote I pulled from a paper about that. And it says, in regards to isoflavone metabolism, there's a striking difference among individuals. So 25% of non-Asian people and 50% of Asian people have the intestinal bacteria that convert daidzein.
Yeah, welcome to the club. Now we're here. We're both here.
Into an isoflavonoid called equal or equal. Also don't know how to say that correctly.
EQ.
Yeah. But basically, more people of Asian descent can make this conversion, and not as many people who have non-Asian ancestry can do it. And it's like I said, it's not something you're doing or you can like increase. It has to do with your native gut bacteria and just not having the right gut bacteria to do it. And so if you have those specific bacteria, you are more likely to benefit from soy consumption. Mind-blowing. So cool.
Yeah.
So when we're seeing these wildly different like results in studies, it could be because that could be one factor. That's why.
Yeah.
And so what equal is, it's a component.
Dude, I dare you to read that. I dare myself, actually. I just feel like it would be so fun to try and get this out. Because you know what it illustrates is like how complex this shit actually is.
Yeah, it's really complex and it's hard to understand. I mean, even for someone who reads research a lot, I'm like, what does this mean? But basically, it's like you have soy, and then inside soy, you have those isoflavones. So the daidzein, genistein. And then when you eat soy, your body pulls those isoflavones, which is also, they're also called polyphenols, out in your gut, break it down. And then your bacteria love to digest polyphenols. It's like one of their favorite things to do. That's why one reason why plant foods are so beneficial for your gut. And so those polyphenols that are in soy, or the isoflavones, can then be eaten by your gut bacteria, also called metabolized by gut bacteria. And then that creates more compounds. And one of those is equal. And so it's something that is made in your gut after you eat soy, but not everybody can make it. Interestingly.
This is the part that I like. It's equal is the word we're saying. The scientific name is 7-hydroxy-3,4. I don't even know what the symbol is after 4. Hydroxyphenylchroman.
So that's
good luck
what
with
your
that.
gut makes.
That is equal.
And then that then has different effects, health effects, and usually they think way more beneficial effects. And it interacts with estrogen receptors differently than other metabolites from soy isoflavones. So all that is to say, people are unique, you're unique, and like soy might be really good for one person and not as great for the other person.
I really hope I'm in the 25% of individuals that are non-Asian. I hope so. This is the tie-in, Hannah, that you put together. I don't want to like steal your thunder, but okay. Oh, wait, there's one other thing I want to say before we move on about this. There's so much. We could have like a 10-part series just about soy. If Mark Messina gets back to us on LinkedIn, I will 100% do that because this is fascinating. So when Hannah is saying you have this native bacteria in your body, your microbiome, it's systemic. You have bacteria coming out of everywhere, right? We used to think it was like 10-to-1 bacteria to human, but then now we're kind of like 2-to-1. Still, like, regardless, there's way more biome than you genetically as a human being. When she's saying that, though, I think it's really important to point out that there's a very common myth that when you take a probiotic or you eat a fermented food, like you take in bacteria, that they stay in you and colonize. It's like a very, very common myth around taking a probiotic supplement or just generally in the world of like GI health. But it is a myth. So we do not have any in a human being study showing that you intake bacteria that is not native to you that stays. It goes in you. It does a job. Hopefully it does a good job. Lots of probiotics do fantastic jobs. Lots of fermented foods do fantastic jobs. And then it leaves. So I think for you to fully, our listeners, I know, Hannah, you grasp this probably better even than I do. So stop me if I'm not saying this right. But it's hard to grasp if you don't know that piece because you think, oh, well, then I'll just eat the probiotics that help me break soy down into equal, or I'll eat fermented foods and that'll help it like that. But that's not the case. There's actually, Andrew and I last night were talking about this because we live so close to MIT. They have these free talks. And I used to go over there all the time because I was like, free at MIT? Yeah, I'm going to go listen. And one was actually a talk about probiotics. And this company, it's a pharmaceutical company. There's biotech is huge here in Boston, and all kinds of pharma companies are here doing their work. This pharmaceutical company was working with a strain of bacteria, and in people who had taken vancomycin, I believe, is the antibiotic to fight C. difficile bacterial infection in the intestine. They have terrible problems after taking that. It takes care of the C. diff, but then it sometimes is very disturbing to the gut microbiome and the balance that's supposed to be there. In those people, they had introduced this probiotic strain that they found evidence of 52 weeks, so a year, after ingesting the probiotic, which is unheard of. But in research studies, as soon as they were done speaking and they were like, are there any questions? I was like, yes. Like, my hand shot up so fast. My friend that I was there with was like, okay, psycho, like what are you going to ask? And I was like, really? Like, you really found evidence? And they were like, yeah, we know. In other worlds, not in functional medicine, people are very, very aware of this, is my point. But in us, that myth has been so pervasive that we think we don't know it. We don't think about it. So it's very important to kind of understand that with this caveat, because you're not going to introduce, unless, you're in that research study and they release this probiotic as a pharmaceutical, unless you've taken that, you're not going to introduce bacteria into your gut yourself that are going to break soy down. You can't change it. You get what you get when you're born. Right. And it's given to you by your really breast milk, and being born is like how you get introduced to the native bacteria that you have for the rest of your life. And hopefully to God, you hang on to those. Mine are gone because of the pink, antibiotics I used to take. Remember the liquid in the fridge, the like pink?
Oh, yep. I feel like every child.
Dude, I lived on that as a kid. So who knows what I have left, but that's the caveat. And then the second thing is that because soy is so heavily sprayed and with fertilizer and like that, there's 3 studies here. I'm sure there's many more. Glyphosate disrupts the microbiome. Mm-hmm. So,
and that is a lot I feel like in vitro and animal studies, which, like we said, you can't always apply that to people. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's really important to pay attention to that, because it's something that is going to continue to develop. Mm-hmm. And, I think that could be something that we wouldn't see the effects of in people for like a long time, because you're, like you said, like the microbiome, you inherit your microbiome kind of from like your mom.
Mm-hmm.
She inherits it from her mother, and then, you know, her lifestyle and diet alters it and then passes that to you. And so over time, it can shift really dramatically. And so that's something that I'm cautious of with foods that are sprayed, because it potentially could be altering your microbiome in a negative way and hurting it, because that's kind of what it's designed to do in pests, insects, or whatever, is to just kill their microbiome. And right, I feel like now,
to kill. And I don't know the mechanism, but yeah, to kill. I mean, it's a killer. You know, it's either a fungal killer or a pest killer or a weed killer. It's like those. That's, oh my God, I actually don't want to do an episode on that. Thanks. Like, that is in the category of things that I am totally okay not knowing about ever, so that I can go to sleep at night. But I think that connection, Hannah, I mean, this was a pearl that you found, like, very, very interesting. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense based on what we see in the research literature. So, okay, let's dig in a little bit more. We're coming up on an hour right now, but I want to hit some of these big points. You know, we talked about, okay, soy has these estrogen-like compounds. So they're very similar to estradiol, to E, and genistein and daidzein. Again, hopefully we're pronouncing that right. I'm sure somebody will correct us. I'm happy to understand how to say it correctly. Mainly what they do is they bind to the receptors that estradiol can bind to, but to a specific type of estrogen receptor. So to estrogen receptor beta. And I think there is just alpha and beta. I should have looked that up before we started, and I didn't, but there are like very specific receptors for estrogen, and there's more than one kind, but the kind that these isoflavones bind to is the beta. The caveat of that is that it's a very weak effect on that receptor compared to the estrogen that we make as humans, our endogenous estrogen. So they do act hormonally, but also non-hormonally, those isoflavones. So it's very, very interesting to see, like, okay, yeah, they do bind, but they bind weakly, and they only bind to the beta form of the estrogen receptor. It's just a little biochemistry to kind of know. And that also explains, like, oh, they're not going to have the same effect as estrogen. And I want to keep, you know, like, talking about this, because I think that has been, at least for me, the biggest sort of like miscommunication between what we know, you know, in biochemistry versus what is said, you know, in the mainstream about soy. They don't act exactly like estrogens, but there are some concerns. And so, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, the positive papers that we found, but what we tried to do, I mean, I think both of us, was to push against our bias of like, wow, we're eating soy now and we feel good and we're not having reactions, into like, okay, well, who should be concerned? And that's actually where I first found Mark Messina. He wrote this really great paper. We'll have all of these links in our show notes. Actually, I like kind of am concerned about people in our show notes. I'm like, are you guys okay in the show?
so hot. Actually, yeah, and sometimes we're like throwing this stuff in here, and it's just kind of a brain dump, I guess. Our show notes are. And my mom just started listening to the podcast yesterday, and she started texting me all these types. She's like, there's a typo here in the show notes. There's a typo here. I'm like, oh God.
That's my fault. I'm the one that puts the show notes in. Yeah, thank you. You can just give her my number, have her text me directly. A friend that produces podcasts that I met person this weekend was like, it's great, you're publishing podcasts. Apparently, like, people will start a podcast and then they kind of like trail off. They like forget about it. He was like, but your show notes. It's like, yeah.
To refine them.
That's an area for improvement. So sorry, everybody, but yeah, we're providing the citations. We'll try and get better about the descriptions. So then again, that's Hannah has nothing to do with that.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I'm the
Okay.
one probably with the typos in there. I just ignore the red line. I'm like, still, I'm just dumping. I'm
Yeah.
like, gotta keep going, gotta keep going. I get on a roll.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we just turn Grammarly on in there and let it do its job. I just don't even think about it. Okay, so Mark Messina has this amazing information about soy. We love this guy. And one of the concerns that he points out in this paper, he says, most notable among the concerns, which in all cases, and I want to emphasize this, are based almost exclusively on in vitro, so outside of the human body research, and animal research. The human research, including both clinical and epidemiological data, so we talked about that clinical, like a direct intervention, epidemiological, looking at connections in a population, are supportive of safety, saying that soy is safe. Is that isoflavone containing products pose a risk to estrogen sensitive breast cancer patients and women at high risk of developing this disease, and that isoflavone exposure via the consumption of soy infant formula may harm the long-term development of infants. Those are kind of the two main concerns. Then he goes on to say, these have been reviewed, got National Toxicology Program, Center for the Evaluation of Risks to Human Reproduction, like these different groups have reviewed this and said that there's minimal concern about the safety of soy infant formula, and we're going to cover that. And then for the discussion of breast cancer, the research literature is huge. I will say, on the breast cancer piece, I could not find a breast cancer study. I looked at randomized control trials, meta-analysis, systematic reviews. Like, I did not look through all 10,000 studies, okay?
What? You didn't?
I know. Didn't. But I could not find a negative result. And I'm curious to see, there is a database of papers with only negative outcomes. I cannot remember the name of that database,
Ooh,
but
that's
it's
cool.
like,
I've never heard of that.
yeah, are you going to Google to see if you can find it? I would like to look in there and see, is there a paper that shows detriment around the topic of soy and breast cancer? I couldn't find it. So on that front, there is that, but I'm totally willing to be checked for sure. And then we'll talk about the soy infant formula. So that is, I think, though, a great, paragraph that he included in this review. And he is also saying, like, we're going to keep an eye on this. It's important. He also states inter-individual differences in isoflavone metabolism. So Hannah, to speak to what you found with the equal, the health status of the person eating it, the metabolic profile of the person eating it, and then differences in the composition of the products of the soy. Those are all factors that can influence the outcome. I just found his writing to be super balanced. So balanced. I didn't even look into him. Normally I'm like, who is this person? What's his background? Is he getting funded by the soy companies? Like, what's his deal? I didn't even do it because he was so balanced in the way that he wrote.
He is balanced. I had never heard of him until you told me about him. And then I was on the Weston A. Price, like, soy alert, soy evidence page. And they mention him because all these studies that they basically compile to say these are the dangers of soy, which, by the way, a lot of those are not reported accurately. But one of those they mention is one of his studies, because he is so balanced, and they kind of highlight, they're like, this is special because Mark Messina is usually a very pro-soy person, but here he's reporting his potential, like, potential, not necessarily dangerous, but things to be aware of.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, that's really, that's the hallmark of, like, someone who has scientific integrity, is like, you're not cherry picking, you're being open-minded and receiving new information and continuing, learning, like, as you go. Anyways.
Yes. Yeah. And Hannah, I think, look, you found this, and it's important. Some, at least, of the information that is on the Weston A. Price Foundation website that is speaking about soy, what they're saying is not supported by the citations that they're using. That is
important to know. If you're
not uncommon.
off of that. Yeah.
But yeah, it is really important. It's like you gotta go to and this is you have to go look at the science and then you gotta eat the thing and see how you feel. You know what I mean? Look, if you have an anaphylactic reaction to soy, obviously it is not for you. If you eat it and you feel like crap, it's not for you. But I think it's really important to, and I don't know how it's even possible. You'd have to do some type of like neural retraining to get the influence out of your brain if you, like us, are one of the people that's was told for, a decade that this is going to like make you sterile and like give
Right.
you breast cancer. That's what we were told. So, okay. Couldn't find negative study on breast cancer or any type of estrogen dependent cancer. That's an important point I want to make. It often comes up that it can negatively affect, or often we were told that through the Weston Price Foundation, it has a negative effect on bone health. There's a few studies I pulled on that, could not find a negative effect on bone health. Although what I will say in those studies, this is important, and this is a population that should consider maybe not eating soy, are people who have hypothyroidism. So a kind of an under-functioning thyroid. In this one study, the title is Soy Reduces Bone Turnover Markers in Women During Early Menopause. Awesome. That's me. I'm having a hot flash right now. As we speak, I can feel the top of my head like I just walked into a sauna. Great for bone turnover markers, like helps with basically reducing risk of osteoporosis. But they spoke to the people in the study. They measured their thyroid stimulating hormone. So, like the hormone that they'll run if you go to your, GP to get testing, not an all indicative of full thyroid health, but it's the marker that they run that does show some thyroid function. There was an increase in that hormone and a reduction in the really active form of thyroid hormone when these women were supplemented with soy protein and isoflavones. So, but this other form of thyroid hormone was unchanged. But I think it's worth saying in a few places I saw it come up that when TSH increases, that shows that the action of the thyroid on the body is kind of decreasing. Like there's a little bit of thyroid function suppression. I don't know the mechanism, like why that would work. And again, kind of based on what you were saying, Hannah, I don't know if that would be in all people, but in this study, there was enough of it occurring that they're like, hey, this is not due to chance. This is something that we're seeing. So if you are somebody that's, I would say people with Hashimoto's, autoimmune thyroiditis, I might be a little bit like, is soy the right food for me? Or somebody that just has underfunctioning thyroid. If like, oh, I have thyroid markers that show I'm hypothyroid, maybe
take soy out and see
be
what
cautious.
happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Be cautious. But, in the conclusion, they're like, it's beneficial for bone health. And again, they're not just like eating tofu sometimes or like drinking soy milk sometimes. They were supplementing. And actually, I will say this, the population was 200 white women. They were given 15 grams of soy protein with isoflavones every day. So let's see for how long.
Maybe they didn't have
for
the
6
right
months.
gut bacteria.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't know that, but.
And it was this like reduced form of soy,
Right.
but it did help bone health, which is wonderful. And there was improvement in cardiovascular risk markers, but then there was this increase in TSH and the reduction in this other hormone. We don't have to get into I'm like, we could go real deep into thyroid physiology, which we're not going to do. But I think that was an important thing to point out for people who have hypothyroid, underfunctioning thyroid. Again, other studies that show benefit of soy food for risk fracture due to osteoporosis. And then in this one study, actually looking at bone health, in the title, the study was called Marked Individual Variation in Isoflavone Metabolism After a Soy Challenge. So, and then the effect on skeletal health in premenopausal, so regularly menstruating women. They are basically speaking to, Hannah, what you found, which is people metabolize soy in different ways, and that will have different effects based on how you metabolize it. Fascinating.
Yeah,
It's
so
absolutely
cool.
fascinating. Yeah, it's really cool.
Well, I think it is. I was trying to explain this to my husband. I was like, listen to this thing I found about soy and your gut bacteria, and just getting like super excited. And he was like, this is a lot. Like, why? What is this? And I was like, it's just so cool, isn't it? Like,
Listen,
so.
actually, I still use it as my computer stand. But when I was reading Alan Gaby's Nutritional Medicine, the book is like,
Mhm.
I actually gave myself tennis elbow by picking the book up. That is a true story. I still have like ligament pain sometimes when I lift weights from that freaking. Thanks, Alan Gaby. The information was totally worth it. I would read it and I would see Andrew after work and I would be like, you're not going to believe this. Like, there's some fact in there about like a certain B vitamin like prolongs LSD trips, which I think it's just like the most random fact that's in this book. And he would be like, what have you been reading all day? So, yeah, God bless our family listening to us talk about this.
Yeah.
Okay, Hannah, do you want to talk about the baby formulas, soy-based baby
Yeah,
formulas?
so
I'm
I
sure that's a
honestly
big
I
question.
didn't have enough time to research this like really thoroughly, but I know it's a big concern because soy-based baby formulas are popular, particularly for babies who are intolerant to milk proteins, like
Hmm.
cow's milk, but then also all this wide array of like reasons why an infant would be needing to have soy
Yeah, like if they
formula. But
need formulas, sometimes babies are directly sensitive to milk. And
yeah,
then we know a lot of moms where, I mean, did you have this where like if they eat dairy and then
their baby
they,
has a reaction.
right, through the breast milk, that
Yeah, that
happens.
didn't happen to me. We had no problems with that, but it's
Okay.
really, really common
Yeah.
now for whatever reason, which would be another great episode. I just keep
We got to
thinking
have
like,
Dr. Harlack on. We're going to get him.
yeah. So, but that's a big thing, and the Weston A. Price Foundation talks about that a lot, and I totally get it because it is feeding an infant a large amount of soy. So this was a study from 1997, so it's old. That's in
Hmm.
science world, that's like super old, but
Yeah.
it was a comparative study in the Lancet, and looking at the exposure of infants to phytoestrogens from soy-based infant formula. And what they found is that the concentrations of isoflavones in these formulas, based on the tiny little infant, 4 month old, and their body weight and how much they're exposed to every day, because, infants drinking their formula like many, many times a day,
Hmm.
it ended up that they were getting like a huge amount of genistein and daidzein, like thousands of times more than like a baby who was on regular formula. So a significant difference. But what does that mean? So like we know that they are like if a baby's having soy formula, they're getting a huge dose of those isoflavones, more than even an adult consuming soy foods. Which, when you're thinking about it that way, it is kind of scary. You're like, oh God, am I doing, is this going to affect this baby while their body's developing, their hormones are developing? But despite all of this, they say at the end, when you put it into practice and look at it in like reality, millions of infants, who have this formula in their life and they consume them every day since the 1960s, it appears that they're growing and maturing normally.
Yeah.
So,
So I found a study, I just have these pulled up and didn't put them in the show notes. Sorry.
oh, that's okay.
That was a 2021 study looking at the difference between cow milk based formula and soy milk based formula
Hmm.
on neurological health,
Hmm.
um, incidences of epilepsy. Here, I'm just going to read off like
Ooh.
the different uh, basically factors that they looked at. Um, yeah, instances of epilepsy, ADHD, or delays of developmental stages. Autism spectrum disorder was also looked at, and there was no difference when they looked at over 150,000 participants. received soy formula. 140,000 some participants received cow's milk formula. So that I think is one concern that parents have, is on the neurological health. And then there is a more recent, that was in 2021, a more recent review. It was from the Canadian Pediatric Society. This was from 2009. Again, kind of the big concern that they report in this review is an effect on thyroid health. I feel like that has come up more as a concern than any other, like breast health or, fertility or like that. I see this science where it's like there really is some interaction between soy and thyroid health that it might be concerning. So, and then the mechanism that they state is, and this is in animal studies, that the phytoestrogens, the genistein and the daidzein, can inhibit thyroid peroxidase. So this enzyme that is related to the thyroid gland, potentially lowering the thyroid hormone that is active in cells, which can lead to abnormal thyroid function. And so they are seeing that possibly in infants. So, that they say the results of animal experiments are often not applicable to human infants. The thing is like they're, of course, seeing these high amounts of these phytoestrogens in these babies because they're drinking the food that has it. I mean, they would absolutely see really high amounts of milk proteins and the constituents in cow's milk or dairy if they were drinking dairy milk. I mean, look, I'll say this. I can feel it in myself. I'm not even a mom, but I would be concerned about that. If that were my kid, I'd be like, oh God, is that okay? But then it's also like, well, if you have a kid that's reactive to everything and they're not reacting to soy, what are you going to feed them?
Exactly. And so that's something to keep in mind with like the fear mongering with it, is that moms are already they're just constantly in a state of guilt about their kids and doing the right thing. And it's like something you can't escape. And so when your kid has multiple allergies and that's the only thing they can tolerate, I mean, of course you're gonna hearing someone tell you this is gonna affect their hormones and like make them have these risk of cancer or whatever the fear-based stuff is. It just breaks my heart because it's not like, we don't know that. How can we say that? And at the moment, that baby is nourished and healthy and developing because they're getting calories in that are helping them develop. And like, that's the most important thing, that baby is fed and healthy. So,
and at the end of the day, they say, I mean, like when you look at adults who were fed soy-based formulas, the health outcomes, they're not different from adults who were fed cow milk based formulas.
Right.
And this is reproductive maturity, cancer development, and general health.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to, I think, point that out. Like, maybe there is a concern, but there's a lot to consider.
Yes.
Okay, the only other thing I wanted to cover was, actually there's two more things I want to cover, but I just don't think we're going to have time to do the studies on lupus. I do want to point out, so there is one study that I found on soy's interaction with the drug valproic acid. And this will definitely, I mean, all of these will be in the show notes. But again, this is one where I was just like waiting at the doctor's office or something and researching this and found this study.
Cool.
So they looked at the actual soy on the interaction of valproic acid, and it's in rats. It's a rat study. So they were given soy extract for 5 days, and what happens, it actually affected the way that valproic acid, it's a drug that is commonly given to people who have bipolar disorder. It's an anti-epileptic drug. Yeah, it's like an alternative to lithium, I believe, when people have acute mania. So when they were given soy, there were differences in the way that drug appeared in the body. So I took pharmacology. I'm still having trouble translating this, but what I would say is if somebody is taking valproic acid, absolutely speak to your pharmacist. Like talk to your doctor also, but speak to your pharmacist before, let's say, consuming soy foods every day.
Mhm.
It resulted in decreases of 57% and 65% in the Cmax of valproic acid. So what does that mean? That's the question.
So do you think it's affecting like the plant compounds in soy, like the polyphenols, are affecting how it's essentially metabolized or detoxed in the body?
Yeah, it's how the drug is metabolized.
Yeah.
So Cmax is the highest concentration of a drug in the blood. So it essentially decreases the concentration of the drug in the blood, cerebrospinal fluid, or target organ. Actually, I have a friend that I think he's just finished his pharmacology degree. I would love to have him on just to talk generally about like drug food interactions, although it's like a little outside of the world of what we're doing with the podcast. But yeah, it's the way that the food and the drug is metabolized. So the valproic acid metabolism occurs in this one way, and then soy metabolism, and specifically the isoflavone, they interfere with that. So soy increases phase 2 metabolism to promote faster detoxification and clearance of potentially carcinogenic intermediates. That's wonderful.
That's what I was wondering. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's super, super cool, except that
if
you're
have that
taking a drug,
right,
there has to be like this consideration of how, soy is a functional food is what it's called. All foods have an effect on us, but some foods have this like more pronounced effect, and we call those functional foods. So actually last night, as Andrew and I are like falling asleep, I'm like, I wonder if there's any other food out there, that has like as much of an effect. I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the show, but it's like it has so many documented effects that seem like a big magnitude. They seem very strong. So soy products can also interfere with levothyroxine replacement. That's a thyroid hormone replacement, warfarin, a blood thinner, right? And tamoxifen, it's like a hormone blocking drug, that are given to people who have breast cancer. And so what they say in this study, in view of these interactions, drugs with a narrow therapeutic margin, so they need to be in like a specific amount in the body, they should be carefully considered with respect to soy. And it's because the metabolism interactions. So
soy is a powerful detox food. It has detox abilities, just like all plant foods. Like if you're listening to this and you're not super familiar with that, one of the, I feel like, most like recited things about functional foods and drug metabolism is the interaction between grapefruit juice and drugs like Xanax, and the caution, like you don't drink grapefruit juice if you're on these certain pharmaceuticals. And I feel like that's like more common knowledge, and that is exactly what you, Vic, are talking about for the listeners to know, is certain plant compounds alter your detox abilities, and so they could speed it up really fast, like it seems like soy helps do, which sounds like it would be good. But if you have this drug that's supposed to be in your body to be staying there to do something important for you, that's not a good thing. And like with the grapefruit juice, it's inhibits, so it slows down certain detox enzymes. So then that drug might build up in your system. And so if you're taking a heavy dose of something like that, that could potentially be dangerous for you.
Yeah. I mean, alcohol, you're often warned. Like I actually I can't remember what drug it was a few years ago, and they were like, you cannot drink. And I was like, okay. Or like St. John's wort is a very famous herb that there's certain drugs that you can't take SSRIs and take St. John's wort at the same time. So again, I mean, absolutely asking your doctor about certain drugs. Pharmacist is often the smartest person in the room. They're wonderful with this knowledge. But then to know, okay, if you're not on drugs, it often is the case that people have an issue because different phases of their detox pathways, like their initial phases, work really strongly and they work well. But the problem is that that first phase of detoxification pumps out a lot of metabolites that are actually more toxic than what you had initially. Kind of a buildup between that phase and the next enzymatic phase that starts to clear out those metabolites. Soy helps that. It helps with phase 2 metabolism,
which is good.
Wonderful. But yeah, that's like you're saying, it's important. So, okay, that's
cool.
I'm like, and even with what we've talked about in this podcast is the tip of the freaking iceberg of the amount of research that we found. So again, just this caveat. I heard this on a podcast yesterday that I was listening to. This is not medical advice.
Oh, yeah.
We should have said this at the top of the episode. There's so much that we have learned just from researching this. We are obviously not experts. Our interest in this really, and the relationship to the podcast period, stems from the fact that so many people are influenced in one way or the other about soy, and there is much, much more to the story. Hopefully we have communicated that and not completely messed up. You're thinking that we're not soy experts. That's what we're trying to say. Mark, please come and save us. Mark Messina. I'm not going to go into this because we're starting to get up on an hour and a half, but there's also interesting research on the benefit, the sometimes great benefit of soy in people specifically who have lupus. And I just want to point that out here at the end because soy is often vilified for all people that have autoimmune disease. And that does not seem to be the case. So I will put that in the show notes so that we can end in a reasonable amount of time. But that was another group of papers, research that I read, Hannah, where I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot more to this than what we've been taught.
It's so much more complex. And
yeah,
obviously soy affects all different aspects of health. It's not just, one thing. And it's not going to, if you're a man, you don't have to be afraid of eating soy unless maybe you have hypothyroidism or you're on valproic acid or, keep in mind those things.
Yeah. Okay. I think we wove our takeaway, pretty well into the evidence.
I think so.
We're in Westlife. Great. Here's the other thing. Do your best to find soy products that are organic, which is if it's organic, it's not GMO or non-GMO or that have not been sprayed. Actually, when I travel sometimes in the airport, they have these little packets of dried edamame. It's like these little dried soybeans. They're not organic, but they say they're non-GMO. I often buy those because I just need some protein.
Good snack.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And it's like, I don't eat it every day.
Right.
It's great. So I think part of what, we can say is balance. But yeah, try to find good sources as you can. And if you, like us, were influenced heavily to think that soy was this total hormone disrupting nightmare, it's just not true in the majority of cases. So hopefully this settles your nervous system a little bit.
Yeah. And if you go to the, Weston A. Price list where they talk about soy and highlight all these studies, find each claim. If you're like, wow, that's really like captivating and intense and like this is kind of scary, go to the actual study and read the abstract if that's all you have access to and what their conclusion is, and look at the numbers, because some of those are not correct. They're the way they're translating it is not what the study says. So
yeah, and that's
always check yourself.
So much of the time, like people I think would be amazed to see what is actually in the research literature versus what is said about the research literature.
Right.
It's a lot less scary out there than you're led to believe, which is why this podcast exists, is so we can be like, hey, it's probably going to be okay.
Chill out.
Totally. Just drink your celery juice and don't worry about it. Okay. Anything else that we need to communicate about soy? I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah. Y'all let us know. Yeah.
I'm going to give you this pearl. If you are somebody who's sensitive to eggs, the best French toast, bar none, I've ever had in my life is if you take soft tofu and you blend it with a little, you can use whatever kind of milk, water, and you make basically the paste, like the batter for French toast, and then you put your bread in that and you fry it as French toast. I think we would put like vanilla, like a little like maple syrup in the blend, and then batter the bread and fry it. The best vegan French toast ever. So
that sounds really good. I want to try that.
That's the takeaway.
That sounds yummy.
Dope. It's so good. Okay. Okay, Anna, I will see you next time.
All right. Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.